1150. An Afghan ruler of the small region of Ghor, with a memorable name, Hussein Ala, defeats the army of the Ghaznavid Empire at Tiginabad and found his own empire, the Ghurid Empire, which lasted a relatively short 60 years, but gave rise to the better known Delhi Sultanate, the first purely Indian Muslim state, founded by an adopted Turkic slave of the last childless Ghurid ruler. Sounds cool, but confusing. However, the Ghurids were not always an Islamic dynasty. They became such only in the early 11th century, and before that they were Buddhists, in fact being the last Iranian Buddhist rulers. With their abandonment of Buddhism, this religion, once one of the dominant ones in Central Asia, finally left the region. But what would have happened if they hadn't had to change it? Welcome to the Synthetic History channel, where we talk about events that didn't happen as if they did. And today, using CK's 3 new DLC, Legacy of Persia, I'm going to tell you the story of how the Ghurids were able to not only preserve themselves, but also revitalize Buddhism in Central Asia, by recreating the ancient, or actually inventing the new country of Bactria. Before telling about the revival of Buddhism in Central Asia, and so for convenience I will call the group of 3 regions Khwarezm, Khorasan and Transoxiana, it would be good to tell about its decline. Its main cause was the Arabs, or rather what they invented and spread: Islam. The Arab conquest of Central Asia began in the second half of the 7th century and ended only 80 years later, becoming the longest and hardest of the early Arab conquests, in which even the Chinese of the Tang dynasty and the Tibetan Empire took part on the sides of local rulers and Arabs respectively. In the conquered territories began a gradual Islamization, carried out at the expense of restrictions for the non-Islamic population, which had previously mostly practiced 3 religions: Zoroastrianism, Buddhism and Manichaeism, who were included into the people of the book primarily because there were no resources for the forced conversion of these essentially pagans. But the conquerors could offer more than blood, tears, destruction and prohibition of alcohol, which however existed in the milder form in Buddhism. Joining the unified Islamic world in the form of a caliphate gave great advantages in trade and the development of science and education, which in turn increased urbanization, and cities in turn became centers of Islamization. And the good old stability that came with the rule of a huge empire should not be forgotten. Stability lasted only 50 years, though. Such huge empires were doomed to collapse, and the caliphate was no exception. After the change of dynasties from the Umayyads to the Abbasids, it began to gradually disintegrate. The power vacuum began to be filled by caliph-appointed Islamized governors of Iranian origin, who began to pursue a virtually independent policy, although de jure they still recognized the authority of the caliphs. From the 9th century, in the history of the region began a period of confrontation between the caliphate, its supporters and its opponents, called the Iranian Intermezzo, which increased in intensity by the second half of the century. At the same time, the caliphate did not live long enough to fully or at least mostly Islamize the local lands, and therefore the emergence of non-Sunni rulers and leaders on the outskirts of the collapsing empire was not uncommon. One such ruler was the Buddhist Malik of Ghor, Amir Suri Ghurid. Ghor was in quite a good place. Easily defensible mountainous terrain and location on the outskirts of the Islamic world made it an unattractive target for conquest, but at the same time there were some silver mines there, and there was some trade through the mountain passes, and with it there were duties. That is, the local rulers had resources, albeit not many, and Amir Suri found a use for these resources, because the then geopolitical situation was in favor of Ghurids. Having concluded in 867 an alliance with the Turks Hephthalites, who were pagans worshipping the sun, and having taken the sister of their ruler as his wife, he went to war on the Indus of the East under the pretext of liberating the local Buddhist population, and by the next year he conquered Ghazni from them. Then he went to war on the ruler of Herat, who was an adherent of Azrakism, a radical branch of Islam, and who also went with raids on neighboring territories, and from that was, let's say, not loved by neighboring rulers. During the Ghurid War in the east, he raided their territories, thus giving a cause for invasion. At the same time, the ruler of Merv, who was also raided, made a revenge attack on Herat. By joint efforts, they defeated the latter's troops. The city was left defenseless and by the next year came under the control of Amir Suri. The conquest of Herat brought both problems and advantages. On the one hand, it was a rather large city, connected to the trade network of the Great Silk Road, giving large tax revenues. But on the other hand, it exposed a problem that Ghurids would have to solve for another 100 years, namely the Islamized urban population, which did not really recognize the authority of pagan rulers. In addition, Islam is a religion system that includes both a spiritual belief system, a community, and a legal system. Consequently, Ghurids had to convert the Islamic population to Buddhism, or at least Zoroastrianism. Makes sense. And here I would like to make a small digression and tell about how Buddhism reached its status of a world religion. Buddhism itself can be called a religion only with a stretch. It is rather a philosophical tradition with a set of practices, ethical norms and rituals that must be observed to achieve enlightenment and reduce suffering in the world. The existence of gods, spirits and everything else in Buddhism is recognized. Prayers can be offered to them, though it is not welcomed. But they are equated to people, and it would be good for them to reach enlightenment too. And it is possible to do it only by incarnating a human being, a mortal. It follows from this that Buddhism can be mixed with any polytheistic religions and other philosophical traditions, like Shintoism in Japan or Taoism and Confucianism in China, absorbing gods into the common pantheon as in Roman paganism. At the same time, Buddhism also offered the advantages of an organized religion. Buddhist monasteries were centers of education, art and science. This was the way it was in Central Asia, having got there at least in the 3rd century BCE, during the existence of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, having observed the worship of local deities and bringing the Indian gods with it. By the way, there is a rather convincing theory that the Japanese god Fujin, who got into the Shinto pantheon through Buddhism, got into the latter from the Greek pantheon, where his name was Boreas, passing along the Silk Road through the centuries across Central Asia to China, while retaining its main symbol, windbag. So, with Islam, as with any monotheistic religion, such syncretism is not much possible. Monotheism can be glued to polytheism, but it is more difficult to glue it to non-theism, which Buddhism really is. I came up with this analogy. Polytheism is a market. The stalls in it have different style and design and sell different goods, but they are all united by a single market structure. Christianity is a hypermarket. You can buy whatever you want in it, but like in the market, you only buy. Islam is a shopping and entertainment center, and Buddhism is an ice cream truck. It can be almost anywhere. You could put it in a market and it won't get any worse there, but try to put it in a hypermarket or a mall and it loses its ice cream truck magic. But they tried. In addition to the usual means used to convert people from one faith to another, such as restricting economical and political opportunities for Muslims, as well as forced conversions, they figured out how to justify conversion by exploiting a loophole in Mahayana Buddhism, which was practiced in Central Asia. The point is that Mahayana Buddhists consider Buddha to be an eternal, omniscient and transcendent being, which coincides with Islam's view of God. Muslims were explained that in fact Muhammad received illuminations from Buddha Maitreya, the coming fifth and last Buddha, who will have to descend someday. And Allah is Buddha. A logical question arises. Why in such a case to convert to an older version of religion? And why then Buddhists themselves do not convert to Islam? For which such smart people received a stick upon their heads. A more convincing way was invented during the reign of Suri's grandson, but I will tell about it later. For adherents of other faiths who lived there were no restrictions. After capturing Herat, Suri decided to take advantage of the protracted war between the Tahirids and the Safavids, in which the former were losing, let their troops pass through his territory, and when they passed, he organized an invasion and raided their eastern lands. The Tahirid troops had to return through the Safarid lands, because no one in his right mind would go into the hostile mountains. As a result of the war, the Tahirids suffered a crushing defeat, lost their southern lands, and with them the status of an important player in the region. And Suri, for his meanness, received the nickname Coward in Arabic and Persian written sources. In 873, he again went to war on the Indus, took their ruler as prisoner and annexed Kabul, and then finished off the Ezrakids. A year later, he openly went to war on the Tahirids, taking from them Guzgan. Thus, in just 10 years, the land under Ghurid control quadrupled. However, Yaqub ibn al-Layth al-Safar, who came out of the conflict victorious, being an ardent Muslim, was already preparing to strike a blow against the pagans. And therefore, Suri, as a real coward, made the most logical decision: swore allegiance to the Samanid ruler, the second power in the region. From this deal, one can understand the attitude of the then rulers of the region to religion, namely that political and economic benefit was in the first place for them, and only then was religion. Why did the Samanids need such a vessel? The point is that between the representatives of the Samanid dynasty, there was a fierce struggle for power, which can even be called a sluggish civil war. And since a good half of the state's lands were governed by Samanids fighting for power, their ruler Amir Nasser needed support with money and troops from outside, and Ghurids provided these resources. Ghurids, in turn, benefited from becoming part of the Samanids. Not only by becoming part of the Samanid state, Ghurids received protection from the Safarids and in addition direct access to the Great Silk Road, which boosted their traders and also gave them the opportunity to invite specialists directly from China. But also Suri continued to gradually expand his domain. First he captured Bamiyan, thereby gaining two cool things: Buddhist monasteries and these huge Buddha statues carved in the stone, and silver mines in the Panjshir Gorge, which became the basis for a future mint. Then he attacked Zabulistan, because the ruler with whom he had made an alliance had died, which sort of untied his hands, and took away the fortresses guarding the passages into the mountains, and then took some more land from the Tahirids and Indus. By 892, Ghurid's holdings amounted to almost half of all Samanid lands, and if we take into account those lands that belong to the Turkic vassals Bani Ghurids, it turns out that more than half of the Samanid lands were not controlled by them. Suri took advantage of this. Having secured the support of the Bani Ghurids, as well as several representatives of the Samanids, he made most likely fabricated claims to the whole Transoxiana. Most likely, because we don't know reliably the ancestors of Suri older than his father, who was mentioned in Persian sources, and Bactrian sources were not shy and attributed to Ghurids the origins from the Parthians and from the rulers of Samarkand. Thank them that at least not to the Achaemenids. When Nasser died after being abused by bandits during his travels, also presumably sent by Suri, he declared himself Shah of Transoxiana and started a war for the throne. Simultaneously, the Bani Ghurids and minor rulers in the east of the country revolted, and then nomadic Turks invaded from the north. Samanid's rule was pretty much over. In 897, they were defeated, and Suri officially became Shah. After becoming a ruler, he began to fight with the Islamist elite. About a third of them agreed to convert to Buddhism at once, dealing with the rest was harder. In 902, Suri founded the Buddhist Holy Order, which is not typical for Buddhism as a religion of pacifism at all, and in its absurdity is equal to the foundation of a Christian military order. Anyway, he also continued the conquest of small countries on the perimeter of the state, recaptured from the Turks Balkh, the center of Buddhism in which there were more than 20 monasteries, made them tributary and established trade along the Silk Road at the state level, concluding a trade treaty with the ruler of the Khitans. For better control over trade, he took Sogd, the richest region between the rivers Sirdarya and Amudarya, from the Samanids, who still owned all the lands in the north of the country, and moved his court and capital to Bukhara, one of the centers of the Silk Road. He died in 908, and his grandson, Narayman the Good, ascended the throne, as his son had died in the war with Zabulistan. By the time of his accession, Ghurids became the strongest force in the region. Safarid Persia, which as it seems 10 years ago was on its way to success, conquered Khorasan and was preparing to unite Iran as in the good old days of Sassanids, disintegrated during the struggle for succession between the children and relatives of the previous ruler. By the way, a good friend of Suri. Nariman continued the policy of his grandfather, waged successful wars with the Safarid remnants, united the whole Central Asia under his rule, invited scientists and specialists from China, built irrigation facilities and Buddhist educational institutions, and so on. Bukhara under him turned into a huge city with a population of 500,000 people, a center of science and culture, blah blah blah. For this he got his nickname the Good, because he improved people's lives. However, much more important were the reforms he introduced. And to explain what he did, I need to explain what Central Asia is. It is a unique region, although if you think about it, all regions are unique. But Central Asia is unique in that it is the crossroad of several civilizations: Persian, Indian, Chinese, Tibetan, and nomadic civilizations. And they all influence the people living there in one way or another. You may be in a large and wealthy trading city, but taking a step off that city, you may see nomads driving a herd of their cattle. Central Asia is called the crossroad of civilizations for a reason. Peoples, or rather groups of peoples, all of them were Iranians with one reservation. There were three, one for each region. In Khorasan lived the Khwarezmians. In Khorasan lived the Khorasans. In Transoxiana lived, that's right, the Sogdians. The latter were the most problematic, because before their conquest by the Arabs, they were independent or very autonomous trading city-states, like the Italian ones. And the status of the crossroads of civilizations divided their population to such an extent that, for example, the inhabitants of Bukhara and Samarkand considered themselves different peoples, not to mention the rest. What I said may sound counter-initiative, but in fact, when there are only foreigners around you, and in such cosmopolitan cities there were a lot of foreigners, it becomes much easier to notice your people. Moreover, these cities competed for essentially one resource: trade traffic, which only increased the dislike of cities for each other. But the problem wasn't even the people, as they didn't matter before industrialization. It was the elites. Nariman faced the big problem that comes before any conquerors, the problem of legitimacy, represented by the elites' question: why do you rule? We rule because we have an army that conquered you, was the answer of all previous rulers of the region. Medians, Persians, Greeks, Kushans, Kidarites, Hephthalites, Turks, Persians again, Chinese, Arabs. So these were either empires for whom Central Asia was a periphery, or nomads with every third person as a combat unit. The answer, of course, is good, but it works only when you have an army that is not dependent on the local population. But now the local ruler actually gets power over the entire region, and creates an empire with a core in Central Asia. His grandfather seized power by force, he holds power by force, and what happens after him? He has witnessed the fall of several Ids already, and the Ghurids were no different. That said, he knows the history of the region quite well, for he and his grandfather had sponsored both Chinese and Persian scholars and historians. He had the texts of Greek historians too, and he himself had traveled to the Buddhist University of Nalanda, which had some records of the Buddhist Central Asia too. Perhaps he even realized that further expansion to the southwest would turn his country into another Persian empire, which he did not do, and probably did not want to do. So how would he deal with this problem? And here is how. In essence, he invented a unified cultural identity for the region from scratch. He explained to the elites approximately the following. Look, we have been under the rule of foreign invaders for more than 1,000 years, in one way or another. Why did this happen? There are two reasons, and they are very simple. The enemies are too strong, and we are too weak and divided. And if on the first we can influence little, then in the second our hands are untied. So we need to become united and build our identity. In doing so, we need to make ourselves as different from those who want to conquer us as we can. And what is the most important part of person's identity? Religion. The Arabs brought their religion here when they conquered the region. We kicked them out, so why do you still pray towards the Mecca and live by Sharia? Even the Persians started either going back to Zoroastrianism or came up with some of their own branches of Islam. Moreover, we already have our own religions, Buddhism and Zoroastrianism. They have been with us all this time. And we will call our country Bactria, because this was the name of the kingdom of our ancestors, which existed here before the arrival of the conquerors. It is not very clear whether Narayman knew about the ancient kingdom of Bactria, which supposedly existed before they were conquered by the Medians in the 7th century BCE, or just made it up, though. Whatever. Nevertheless, it is not enough to separate from the others. A state must have a purpose. What is our main advantage? Trade in general, and the Silk Road in particular. Goods and ideas move along it, passing from hand to hand dozens of times, giving a huge profit to all participants of trade. We are the center of this exchange. By providing a safe road for traders, we will in turn provide an influx of resources and a base of support for all who use the road. That road will be the Northern Silk Road, winding around the Caspian Sea from the north and leading to the Black Sea. Thanks to this road, we will not be dependent on Persians and Arabs for trade, and the Greeks, as the destination of the road, are too far away from us to influence us in any way. In addition, for communication between traders and for concluding agreements, we need to use some kind of language, and it just so happens that Sogdian was that language. It was used on most of the Silk Road. So we will create a universal Khwarezmian Sogdian language. These are languages of the same subgroup. Adapt the Sogdian script to it and call it Bactrian, despite the fact that the real Bactrian language at the time still existed, but nobody cared. Narayman spent a good part of his life touring the country, persuading the local elites of the necessity and benefits of unification, and at the same time establishing ties with the Silk Road traders. He himself, by the way, was a famous trader and knew almost all the important languages of Asia, from Greek to Chinese. And he succeeded. In some cases, it was necessary to take away possessions from the opposing elites by force, but mostly they agreed to accept the new identity and Buddhism as the state religion. Thus, from scattered cities, somewhere in 940s, in Central Asia, after 1500 years, Bactria was born again. And with it, Bactrian culture began to form. A little overboard was Khwarezm, which unlike Khorasan and Transoxiana actually had an ancient state tradition and always enjoyed more autonomy. So Narayman made it a periphery and appointed his son viceroy of this area. He spent the rest of his reign, and he ruled for almost 60 years until 966, consolidating and developing the newly formed country and fighting against the nomads. And after his death, Bactria continued to exist. Moreover, his descendants began to extend the empire's borders to the south and east, conquering the Indus and Tarim basins. The conquest of the former gave Bactrian merchants access to the oceanic trade of the maritime Silk Road, and the conquest of the latter gave direct access to China, where the Song dynasty had just established itself, under which trade and crafts developed. Thus, Bactria secured for itself almost a monopoly on trade in the Silk Road to the west of India. However, these conquests were beneficial only in the short term, but in the long term they turned Bactria into an ordinary empire, and this region had seen many empires. The conquered territories became centers of instability for the empire, because the local elites, not interested in imperial power, sponsored any movement leading to its decline. Such a movement was the invasion of Bactria by the Turks under the leadership of Tughril Seljuks in 1042. Taking advantage of the accession of a minor ruler to the throne, he united the scattered nomadic tribes and defeated the army of the former at the Battle of Ramitana, near Bukhara. Thus he became the ruler of Bactria, which somehow did not collapse from the change of central power. But Tughril decided not to stop at the conquest of Bactria and invaded Persia, conquering it in 1050. And although he was a Buddhist with an admixture of Zoroastrianism, which for nomads of the time after intensification of trade on the northern Silk Road became the norm, he located his court in Persia, in Isfahan, called himself the ruler of Persia, and his descendants went into full Zoroastrianism. The Seljuk Empire stretched from the Mediterranean Sea to China, and as in the case of any empire founded by nomads, as soon as the nomads were over, it began to fall apart. By the 1090s, there was a number of rebellions in the empire that caused it to cease to exist, and a power vacuum was created in the region. Meanwhile, in Bactria most of the power was seized by the Ghurids, who didn't just magically disappear after the Seljuks victory. Bactria and its cities did not lose their main role as trade facilitators, so many of the Ghurids were governors during the Seljuks' reign, ensuring competent management of the region. After collapse of the latter, they enjoyed great legitimacy due to the length of the rule, and managed to become a brand for Central Asia. The most powerful was naturally the ruler of the richest region, Afghan, the king of Transoxiana, who in 1104 declared himself the ruler of all Bactria. But it was possible to unite the region completely only by 1150. First of all because Buddhism was not an empty word for the local rulers, and they did not want to fight against their own people. And the princes did not want to join peacefully, as they did not see any threat for themselves. However, when such a threat appeared in the form of an invasion of a new nomadic empire, the Mongolian state of Karakitai, which had already taken away the Tarim basin from Bactria, they all quickly came to their senses. By united efforts, they fought off the nomads, and by 1158 they even pushed them behind the mountains, and also beat out of them the right to duty-free trade through the Tarim basin. But, of course, the important thing was not the shifting of the borders to the north. The really important thing was that Bactria survived, revived, and continued to exist in the form envisioned by its creator, Nariman, and the Ghurids even remained in power. Of course, by survival I mean primarily the survival of the country as an idea, as the region had been developing and growing all this time. Urbanization, irrigation, culture, science, roads, all that stuff. However, Bactria had one more challenge to face. At the same time, in the steppes of Mongolia, a certain man was born and started his journey. A man who will go down in history under the name of Genghis Khan. And this name speaks for itself. And if Tughril Seljuki did not actually loot and destroy cities because he was a Buddhist, then this guy was held back only by heaven, if you know what I mean. But that's a subject for another story, and I'd like to end this story here. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and leave a comment. And subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content like that. And with that, I bid you farewell.